to NASA, it seemed that the Russians were citing their own equivalent of three-man Apollo program. Towards the end of 1964, cosmonaut Alexei Leonov began training with a new piece of equipment. As was hoped, capsule would be fitted with a collapsible canvas airlock that would let him leave the craft. The Voskhod capsule's electronics used thermionic valves which relied on ambient air to dissipate the heat, so the capsule could not be depressurized. In March 1965, Alexei Leonov on Voskhod became the first person to leave his capsule and freely in space. Again, the Soviet Union had beaten America in one of the capital steps NASA had stated it would need to master before an attempt at landing on the moon. The complete story did not emerge until after the fall of the Soviet Union. Once outside, Leonov's spacesuits swelled like a balloon, making him too large to re-enter the airlock. Only by drastically venting his suit pressure could he squeeze back inside. The Gemini spacecraft was a huge advance in capsule design. Mercury astronauts Gus Grissom had been involved in the capsule development and was responsible for the way pilot control systems were reassembled aircraft. Aircraft controls like Mercury capsule, it had corrugated titanium skin, but the life support system and power were housed in a separate module that was discarded before re-entry. The astronauts had separate hatches and sat in ejector seats. Importantly, these hatches could be reopened and closed in space to allow for spacewalk. The first manned Gemini flight, Gemini 3, blasted off in July 1965 aboard for Gus Grissom and John John. 3 orbits and 5 hours later, their craft landed in the Atlantic just west of the Bahamas, 84 kilometers south of the intended target. Importantly, Gemini 3 had been the first spacecraft to change its orbit, a vital development towards NASA's short-term goal of orbital rendezvous. Grissom and John's flight had been a morale booster for America's space effort, and they were treated as heroes. Less than a week after their return, the two astronauts were given a ticker tape parade through the streets of New York. People were now taking the idea of a moon landing seriously. At the White House, the astronauts met with President Johnson. In parallel with Gemini program, hardware for the Apollo missions continued development. The final configuration of the Apollo spacecraft had been decided and mock-ups were fabricated for use in testing other parts of Apollo system, because the Apollo command module was bigger than all previous spacecrafts. The designer had opted to return to the use of an escape tower similar to the Mercury capsule to lift the crew clear in an emergency. A special launcher known as the Little Joe was developed to test the escape system under a variety of simulated malfunctions. During one trial, a real problem occurred and the escape tower worked perfectly. Dummy capsules were dropped from aircraft to iron out problems with the landing parachutes. Because the Apollo missions would all splash down in the ocean, the capsule was tested in the water. There was always a trade-off between weight and strength, and sometimes the engineers had to go back to the drawing board, testing of the new Saturn rocket and its refinement. The Saturn 1B was going well with no test flight failures. On the morning of June 3rd, 1965, Gemini 4 was being prepared for astronauts James McDivitt and Ed White. It will be their first flight. This would be the first mission control from the new integrated Mission Control Center in Houston. Launch control remained the Cape But after the launcher had cleared the tower, all aspects of the remaining Gemini and Apollo flights were controlled from this complex. This would be NASA's first long-duration flight. An attempt was made to rendezvous with a tight in upper stage, but with little success and depleted fuel reserves. The exercise was abandoned. Above Australia, White and McDavid donned their spacesuits and began depressurizing the capsule. Eddie White had to struggle with his hatch door, which had jammed after attention from McDavid, who understood the problem. It opened and White stepped outside. He was tethered to the spacecraft by an 8-meter line that fed him oxygen to maneuver. He had a space zip gun that expelled oxygen. It worked well but was soon running low on the gas. Communication problem meant that while mission control could hear him, they could not speak to him. Messages had to be relayed via McDavid. It all looked deceptively simple, but other than be outside, White had no real task to perform around the world. These pictures captured huge press attention right from its inception. NASA had made a commitment to openness. It was the one glaring difference between America and its Cold War adversary. Jim McDavid and Ed White, both alumni of Michigan University, which held a ceremony for the astronauts when they were back on the ground. Although the Soviet Union may still be ahead in the space race, America was catching up, and the unfettered access NASA allowed the press meant that the Gemini program became a media phenomenon. For McDavid and White, there followed the now regulation ceremonial at the White House. Public support meant that lavish funding kept flowing and accelerated development of Apollo hardware continued. Behind the scenes, the testing of the Saturn I had concluded, and his direct descendant, the Saturn 1B, was being fabricated for several unmanned missions. It was earmarked for the first manned Apollo flight scheduled for 1967. The giant C-5, now known as the Saturn V, was also being built. This was the rocket that would take man to the moon. Unlike the cluster tanks hastily pressed into their service for the Saturn I, Saturn V had larger, lighter line tanks, and it replaced the 8 H1 engines with 5 much larger F1 engines. Gemini 5 launched in August 1965. It was the first time a spacecraft had been powered by fuel cells rather than batteries. This would enable flights of much longer duration. But the system gave problems. In addition to the spacecraft, thrusters were unreliable. The crew of Gordon Cooper and Perry Conrad were forced to abandon a rendezvous exercise through diminished electrical supply and limited control of their craft. But Gemini 5 did set a new record for endurance. As Wally Schirra and Tom Stadford sat in their Gemini 6 spacecraft and Atlas Agena on a descent pad was ready for launch. The Gemini capsule had been designed for docking, and in October 1965 they would make the first attempt to rendezvous and dock with the Agena target vehicle. The launch of the Agena was perfect, but shortly after, stage separation radar picked up 5 distinct objects. The craft has exploded. There was no point in proceeding with the mission. Scheduling for the Gemini program had been tight, with roughly one new launch every 6 weeks. There was no replacement. Agena ready to launch before the next flight, Gemini 7. It was decided that Gemini 6, now called 6A, would rendezvous with Gemini 7, which would launch first. This would mean a very rapid turnaround between launches, which used the same facilities in December 1965. Frank Borman and Jim Lovell were preparing for NASA's longest duration mission, yet the plan called for a flight of 14 days, more than long enough for a return trip to the moon. The schedule called for